Lecture 7. Western Imperialism, 1800s to the 1900s. As described in the previous lecture, during the 1700s, Europeans founded trading posts throughout Asia. The Spanish of the time were able to establish the first European colony in the Philippines. In the 1800s, European countries followed Spain's example by transforming many of their Asian trading posts into colonies. In the midst of this colonization, Britain emerged as the dominant European power. France, Russia, and the United States also imposed their will over Asia. At times, these great world powers competed with one another for dominance, as was evident in the Crimean War, which lasted from 1853 to 1856, which Russia lost to an alliance that included the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, and Piedmont Sardinia. Even though the Crimean War had at least symbolically begun to determine who would control the Holy Land, Britain entered the war in order to diminish Russian expansion into Asia. The British in Asia. From 1803 to 1815, in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain and France struggled with one another over who would be the foremost world power. During this conflict, neither country invaded the other. Rather, each tried to reduce the influence the other country had in world politics. The British did this by taking control over regions that were either directly under French control or ruled by French-dominated countries, specifically the Netherlands and Spain. This included locations in Southeast Asia. When Napoleon Bonaparte was finally defeated in the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, the British solidified their power throughout the world. In so doing, the British replaced the role of the Dutch, who had been the #1 European power in Southeast Asia. In 1798, the Dutch controlled Ceylon, currently Sri Lanka, became a British dominion. Similarly, between 1811 and 1816, the British took over the French control Java, an island of Indonesia. In 1816, the British returned Java to the Dutch in order to gain Dutch support against the British. In 1819, the British also took over Singapore, which had been under Dutch rule. China fell under British control during the 1800s. Britain wanted to control China for the same economic reasons they were interested in Southeast Asia. The Chinese products that the British wanted included silk, porcelain, and tea. The product that the British frequently traded for these Chinese goods was opium. In order to stop Chinese people from being destroyed by opium addiction, the Chinese government tried to prevent the British from importing opium into China. The British response was war. The first war between Britain and China was, logically, named the First Opium War, lasted from 1839 to 1842. The war ended in 1842 with Britain as the victor. The war concluded with the Chinese government signing the humiliating Treaty of Nanking. According to this Nanking Treaty, China was required to compensate the British for opium that was lost or destroyed during the war. In addition, the treaty granted the British the right to trade at Chinese ports. Finally, Hong Kong was given to the British as a colony. Hong Kong was not returned to China until 1997. From 1856 to 1860, the British and Chinese engaged in a second war called the Second Opium War. This war ended with a series of treaties called the Convention of Peking. The Convention of Peking mandated that China pay the British for engaging in the war. The convention also required the Chinese to permit the British to ship Chinese people from China to British colonies. Once these Chinese people arrived in the British colony, they were to pay for the cost of the voyage by working for British colonists. The French in Southeast Asia. From 111 BC, beginning with the Han Dynasty, to 938 AD, Vietnam was ruled by China with two brief interruptions. The first interruption, which we already mentioned, was from 40 to 43, when the Trung sisters revolted against the Chinese, pushed them out of Vietnam, and ruled. The second was from 544 to 602, when for about 60 years Vietnam revolted once more and regained its independence from China. This ended in 602 when China, under the Sui dynasty, once again defeated the Vietnamese and ruled over northern Vietnam. Finally, in 938, Vietnamese troops successfully defeated the Chinese, specifically the Southern Han. Afterwards, the general who led the troops ruled Vietnam as a king. In the 1400s, Vietnamese autonomy ended once again when the Chinese Ming dynasty invaded and took back Vietnam. The Ming rule over Vietnam lasted only briefly from 1407 to 1427. In 1427, the Vietnamese rebelled and defeated the Chinese. From 1428 to 1787, Vietnam, known as Dai Viet, was governed by the Le dynasty. Le Loi was the founder of this dynasty. He had successfully led the Vietnamese people to victory against China's Ming dynasty. The following century, in 1533, according to imperial records of the Le dynasty, a Western priest introduced Christianity in the province of Nam Dinh. Records of Nguyen, a highly influential family that under the Le vied for power with the Trinh family, stated that in 1596 the Spanish Catholic priest Diego Adverte evangelized the Vietnamese in the Quang Nam province. In 1615 and 1626, the Jesuits founded Vietnam's first Catholic missions. These Jesuits had recently been kicked out of Japan. The Jesuit missions were founded under the supervision of a Portuguese church overseer. The reason for this was that since 1493, out of respect of Pope Alexander VI's bull, Inter Cetera, missionaries, no matter what their country of origin, first traveled to Lisbon, Portugal, to give their allegiance to the Portuguese king before going to Asia. In the 1700s and 1800s, Vietnam was significantly threatened by a foreign power, this time from the Western European world. Prior to the 1700s and 1800s, the Vietnamese had encountered European merchants as far back as the 1st century AD during the time of the Roman Empire. These early European merchants were interested in trade and not in ruling over Vietnam. This changed when the French, starting in the 1700s, gained greater presence in Vietnam. In 1787, the French government, by signing a treaty, supported a military intervention in Vietnam. The French signed the treaty in order to heed the advice of a French missionary bishop, Pierre-Joseph Georges Pignot. Bishop Pignot, who was ministering to the Vietnamese, requested France to back Prince Nguyen An against a rebellion against the Nguyen dynasty led by the Tai Son brothers of the Binh Dinh province. This rebellion began in 1772. The treaty was signed on November 28, 1787, by the French foreign minister and by Bishop Pignot. In it, France promised to aid Prince Nguyen An in his fight against the rebellion. In exchange, the Prince Nguyen An granted the French exclusive commercial freedom in Vietnam and religious freedom for Catholics in Vietnam. In 1802, Prince Nguyen An defeated the Tai Son rebellion and established himself as Emperor Gai Long. About 50 years after Prince Nguyen An became emperor, France began intensifying its interventions in Vietnam, including militarily. The military advantage of the French caused Vietnam to sign the Treaty of Saigon in 1862. According to the treaty, France was granted land over the region around Saigon. By 1874, French naval officers who had been governing Saigon annexed more land out of what was created the colony of Cochin, China. During the same time, the naval officers also founded a protectorate to govern Cambodia. Similarly, in 1893, France formed a protectorate over Laos. Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, which were all grouped under French rule in 1897 as a Federation of Indochina. A major product that was imported by the French out of Indochina was rubber from rubber tree plantations. The country that the French focused more attention on administering was Vietnam. While leaving the Cambodian monarchy in place, the French relied upon Vietnamese to administer Cambodia. As a result of French interest in Vietnam, in particular of the South, Vietnam was greatly influenced by French culture to such an extent that its southern central city, Saigon, was known as the Paris of the Orient. Many South Vietnamese, consequently, assimilated French culture, converted to Catholicism, and spoke French. The U.S. and Asia. The U.S. presence in Asia became prominent in the mid-1800s. American presence was often accompanied by military force known as gunboat diplomacy. In 1846, the U.S. practiced hard diplomacy by firing shells from a U.S. ship into Da Nang of central Vietnam with the intent of motivating the Vietnamese government to release a U.S. missionary who had been spreading Christianity despite being ordered not to. Soft diplomacy was attempted by the U.S. in 1846 when Commodore James Biddle was sent to Japan with 2 U.S. Navy ships in order to establish trade and diplomatic relations. The Japanese officials who received him politely rejected his requests. Biddle then went to China and made the same request to the Chinese, who agreed to sign a trade treaty with the U.S. government. In 1852, the U.S. President Millard Fillmore resorted once again to hard gunboat diplomacy by sending Commodore Perry with 4 warships to Japan. They arrived in Japan's Uraga Harbor on July 8, 1853. Upon arriving, Perry handed over a letter to the Japanese officials. The letter was from the U.S. President and was addressed to the Japanese Emperor. Along with this letter, Commodore Perry also delivered his own letter to the Emperor, and this letter contained a veiled threat, as will be evident soon. I'm going to read an excerpt of it. Therefore, as the United States and Japan are becoming every day nearer and nearer to each other, the President desires to live in peace and friendship with your Imperial Majesty, but no friendship can long last unless Japan ceases to act towards Americans as if they're her enemies. The undersigned holds out all these arguments in the hope that the Japanese government will see the necessity of averting unfriendly collision between the 2 nations by responding favorably to the propositions of amity. And here's the veiled threat. Many of the large ships of war destined to visit Japan have not yet arrived in these seas, though they are hourly expected, and the undersigned, as an evidence of his friendly intentions, has brought but 4 of the smaller ones, designing, should it become necessary, to return to Edo in the ensuing spring with a much larger force. But it is expected that the government of your Imperial Majesty will render such return unnecessary by acceding at once to the very reasonable and pacific overtures contained in the President's letter. End of quote. Commodore Perry remained in Uraga, Japan for about 10 days before leaving to the coast of China. Around 6 months later, he returned to Japan, but this time with 6 ships armed with more than 100 cannons. The Japanese Tokugawa shogunate, a type of hereditary military general, who was the actual political power and not the emperor, responded in 1854 by signing the Treaty of Kanagawa, thereby agreeing to the U.S. requests. By agreeing to U.S. demands, the Tokugawa shogunate set the stage for their decline in political power and the rise of a new centralized government in the Meiji Restoration of 1868 with the emperor as the formal political leader. Perry, the U.S. president, and many Americans were influenced by a number of factors that helped cause them to be convinced that their gunboat diplomacy with the Japanese was justified. These factors included philosophical, economic, political, and religious motivations. Philosophically, the U.S. believed in a general idea called manifest destiny. The historian William Earl Weeks identifies 3 central themes that repeatedly are stressed in the various expressions of manifest destiny. They are, and I quote, the special virtues of the American people and their institutions, their mission to redeem and remake the world in the image of America, and the American destiny under God to accomplish this sublime task. End of quote. The economic and political motivations included the desire to expand U.S. trade relations and to protect the American whaling industry that needed supply states and safe harbors when Americans were shipwrecked. The religious motivation was promoted mainly by Protestant missionaries who believed they had a divine calling to spread the gospel in Asia. In contrasting the style of evangelization in Asia by Jesuit priests with U.S. Protestant missionary style, the scholars of East Asia, a cultural, political, social history state this. In contrast to priests who first spread Catholicism around the globe, 19th century missionaries who likewise took the world as their stage were often non-denominational and as likely to be female as male. Unlike the Jesuits who tried to conciliate power holders and adjust to local practices, missionaries from Britain and the United States had a vision of Christianity that admitted no compromise with what they deemed heathen practices and belief. Impatient at restrictions on their activities imposed by treaties, they caused more than one international incident. The Russians in Asia. Shortly after the U.S. was establishing its presence in Asia, Russia in the 1890s intensified their efforts to gain control in Asia. The Japanese defeat of the Chinese in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, motivated the Russians to reach into China in order to push out Japanese presence, which the Russians feared were threatening Russian power. According to the Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed between representatives of Japan and China in 1895, China agreed to recognize the autonomy of Korea. China agreed to give Japan Taiwan, formerly Formosa, and a number of islands by Taiwan, and China agreed to give to Japan the eastern portion of the Liaodong Peninsula Bay. To contain Japan's thrust into China, Russia, backed by Germany and France, convinced Japan to give up its claim over the Liaodong Peninsula Bay under the condition that China would pay for the loss of the bay with the help of a Russian loan. Later, in 1896, Russia signed a Lobanov Treaty in which Russia pledged to defend China's territory against further incursions by foreign powers. Russia also obtained a lease from China over the Liaodong Peninsula, which enabled them to build a naval base called Port Arthur. Other agreements beneficial to Russia were also obtained from China. God bless.